The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
The 1990s were marked with a lot of pitched battles between the unions and the non-union businesses and business owners across British Columbia. But we've come a long way in 16 years, and I'm hopeful that this time with the NDP in power, that they'll be a little bit smarter about how they approach the business community, and that they'll remember just how important business is to creating jobs and creating affordability for workers.
Well, good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and the labor movement is in town in Victoria for a convention this weekend, a big policy convention, and we're lucky to have a couple of the leading labor leaders in British Columbia on the show tonight. Stephanie Smith, BC Government and Service Employees Union. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Vaughn.
Good to be here. Irene Lanzinger, BC Federation of Labor, the all-powerful labor organization. What's the convention all about?
Well, it's a conference actually, because we went to a convention every 2 years. So the year that we don't have a convention, we have a conference. So we call this the Union Renewal Conference. And it's about strengthening the labor movement, strengthening our unions, the work we do as a labor movement. The theme of this one is precarious work, the new changing nature of work and how we deal with that, and how we continue to ensure that there are good jobs, that workers' rights are represented, that there's good wages and benefits for workers as work changes.
You checking out the new government as well?
Of course, yes. I had a meeting this afternoon with Green Party leader Andrew Weaver, and I'll be meeting tomorrow with Minister Adrian Dix. So always take an opportunity when I'm in Victoria to touch base. Yeah.
So something I've been noticing walking around town in Victoria recently that I hadn't seen for years is pretty much every little business and fast food outlet and pizza parlor has a sign on the door saying now hiring. And it's been a long time. I would guess 2005, 2006 that we last saw that. So there's a shortage of workers in British Columbia all of a sudden. What's the story?
Well, I think wages are too low. So I think these are places that are probably paying less than $15 an hour. And when you earn less than $15 an hour, it's very, very difficult to live in this province. So you are always going to move to a higher wage job. Because that's the way to survive. So that I think we just aren't paying high enough wages to keep workers or to bring people into the workforce. Because it's for some people, there has to be a job at a certain wage before they'll come into the workforce. Affordability is a huge issue, and people just cannot live on some of the wages that are being offered right now.
Other factors in the economy?
Well, I would certainly agree with Irene. I think affordability is a huge issue. I have two young adult children, 27 and 25. Both of them work in non-unionized service industry jobs. Clearly, one of them still lives with me. Affordability for rents or housing, and the other pieces of all of that, which is, being able to afford childcare, getting into the labor force. It's one of the reasons why the BCGEU has partnered with the Coalition of Childcare Advocates for a number of years on finally implementing an affordable childcare for workers in British Columbia.
One thing that jumped out at me in the many, many submissions on Site C, which is the government's going to decide on next month, was an interesting one from the allied construction unions up there, which are an alliance, includes the building trades. And they talked about, they actually support the project, but they lamented something that I know has been a big issue for the Fed, which is apprenticeships and the target for many more apprenticeships on government jobs. We've had some half-hearted commitments from the provincial government on this. First of all, tell people what the issue really is and then what the target is.
Well, one of the big obstacles to people completing their trades training is them finding apprenticeship jobs, right? So placements as apprentices. And that is almost always a 4-year proposition. So you may have a project that lasts a year and a half, then your job is done, and then you have to find another job or another employer that will take you on as an apprentice.
So these are skilled tradespeople.
These are skilled tradespeople, and they're getting their red seal or their final qualification, and they have a hard time finding employers who take them. The biggest poacher of apprentices or of tradespeople, and the biggest employer that fails to train apprentices is the provincial government.
Really?
Very few. I mean, there are some on BC Hydro and some of the Crowns, but on big projects, the government does not really do their part in having apprentices on those jobs. And we have been lobbying about that issue for many, many years. We lobbied the Liberal government on it. They did a few little half-hearted things, but not much, really. So you need an apprentice. You need that apprentice to have jobs throughout that 4-year period. And you need supports around that, too, because often these are young people. They need some support to complete that. So we're hopeful that that will change. And it's not just the projects, that's the easier piece of it. It's public entities like universities, schools, hospitals, the government itself in their buildings. You look at, I mean, I was a teacher in Vancouver. Those old schools had many tradespeople who had to come to fix the heating system, and carpenters and painters to maintain the schools. And we are not training apprentices in our public services, our public entities, or on big public projects.
Because, I mean, I remember having Jim Sinclair on the show once, and he talked about, like, these are really good jobs.
They are good jobs, especially the union ones.
Yeah, and they pay really well. And you go from job to job, so you're not necessarily in the same place. High skill, good benefits, again, union jobs. But it's interesting, I mean, we've been telling people this for a while. Are they going out there and then finding there just aren't the entry-level positions to actually get the apprenticeships, to get the jobs?
Yeah, I think it varies, but I think many apprentices do struggle. And the barrier to their completion is not being able to find those jobs or having someone shepherd them through that process. The other thing I would point out is that we have a fairly significant group of tradespeople who are in their 50s, late 50s and early 60s and will want to retire. Because
young
that
people,
was
as I see them, I'm 65. But yeah, I know what you mean. You're right.
We have to train the next generation of people to take those jobs. We will always have to build infrastructure in this province. It's an important part of our communities, our community centers, our schools, our hospitals. I mean, we need tradespeople. They're good jobs. They have supported many communities, particularly rural communities in this province. Those jobs have.
Other thing, before we go to the questions on tape, Stephanie, the government publishes every week orders and council cabinet appointments, and they're a new government, so they're still filling a lot of slots. One of the things I've been watching for is again an issue that Jim Sinclair raised when he was head of the Fed and he was on this show, which was the old Liberal government, especially under Campbell. Labor people weren't appointed to anything, even issues where there were big labor issues like industry training and so forth. Are you starting to see some change in that regard?
We are. We're starting to see some change there, and I would agree. I think the imbalance that happened, particularly around issues that are of importance to labor, Workers' Compensation Board, the ITA, we saw a real imbalance happen.
Industry Training Authority.
Authority, yes. Thank you. Speaking in acronyms,
That's okay.
It's a trade thing.
It's a trade union thing.
But we're starting to see now that workers' voices are beginning to be represented on some of the appointments are happening. You know, at Workers' Compensation, there are 9 board members, you know, that increased from 7. There's 1 worker representative there, which doesn't make any sense to us. So for us, it's about reestablishing a balance. We understand industry and business need to have a voice as well. Public interest needs to have a voice, but workers' voices have been neglected over the last 16 years for sure.
Well, we do have a lot of questions on tape, and you did mention that you'd met the Green Party leaders, so Bill Tillman has a question about your attitude toward the Greens. Here is Bill.
Irene and Stephanie, Andrew Weaver, the leader of the BC Green Party, practically vetoed any possibility the NDP government would move to have union certification by signed membership card, something Labour cherishes. He also interfered in the possibility of a $15 minimum wage in a quick way and some other things. How much does that alienate Labour movement members? How much is that a problem for the Green Party?
You talked to him about this?
Yes, we have talked to Mr. Weaver about both of those issues. We don't agree with him on the majority sign-up issue for sure, but there are other things we can do. The big problem in union organizing is employer interference. And the reason that we like the card check system is that it's the best way to deal with that issue. Yeah. But there are other ways to deal with that issue.
So the two ways that you can have people join a union.
Yeah.
The current system is that a bunch of people want to start a union. Eventually there's a vote. Right?
Yeah, you sign cards and then we meet threshold of cards and then you have a vote.
The other system is called card check.
Card check,
and
or
essentially
majority
people
sign up.
sign enough cards, you hit the majority, you
get
got
a
the union.
Yeah.
Right? Your view is that the card check system is less subject to intimidation by the employer.
That's right. Okay. That's right, because you can do it sort of under the radar. And what happens is between the card signing and the vote, in some cases, there's a very high level of employer interference. We've had employers put big screens up in the workplace with anti-union messages in that 10 days before the sign-up and the vote in order to stop the... we've had employers threaten to close up shop, to fire employees. You know, all of these things happen in that gap. So one solution, and we've talked to Mr. Weaver about that, is to shorten the time between the sign-up and the vote. Okay. The other is to have strict penalties when employers do interfere, so that if you can prove in a hearing that there's been unfair labor practices and the employer's interfered, you get an automatic certification.
Did you get anywhere with them?
I think he was sympathetic on the issue of employer interference. I mean, his experience is in a faculty association, and one of our ideas is to get him together with people who organize, some of Stephanie's members and activists who organize in much more difficult climates, and some who've been fired because of union organizing drives. But we think there are some ways to deal with that issue. If we can't get card check, then we'll work on some other issues.
We've got a question coming up a little later on the minimum wage issue, so I'll leave that to then. I think Stephanie's going to want to comment on this one, because this is the other big thing. Caught a lot of us by surprise when we got the budget update that this wasn't in it. So let's go to Bill Tillman again.
Stephanie, BCGEU has worked for a long time with the child care advocates of BC to promote the $10 a day child care. And yet Andrew Weaver suggested it wasn't good enough, it wasn't the right program, that he would not agree with that, despite all the experts being in favor of it. How frustrating was that for you as the union president and also a longtime advocate?
That's a really good question. I'm actually an early childhood educator. That's my background. I worked as an ECE for 30 years. We represent about 2,000 early childhood educators around the province, and we were extremely excited to see the NDP government campaigning on $10 a day childcare. So yes, we were disappointed. We understand, though, that this particular budget was really an update to the Liberal budget, and so we're optimistic that we will see bolder steps being taken in the upcoming budget in February. We continue to talk to the Minister of State, Katrina Chen. Our component, Vice President Andrea Duncan, has been a very strong advocate. We continue to work with the Coalition and the Early Childhood Educators of BC. Again, I think, Mr. Weaver has very strong opinions on what he thinks will work for British Columbians. I think the Coalition has really done the groundwork, though. They've already done the consultation. They've spoken all around the province. And as Bill pointed out, they've spoken to numerous experts. Chambers of Commerce are in agreement with this plan moving forward. They recognize the need for an accessibly publicly funded childcare system for British Columbian working families. So I'm optimistic. They've got a lot to deal with in an upcoming budget, but this is, I think this is a priority for British Columbians.
Sonia Firstino was on this show a couple of weeks ago, and she's the Green person dealing with this file, and she sounded pretty optimistic. Like she said, there'll be something. They're still working on the details, but I didn't get the sense that the Greens are really opposed to this going ahead. They may argue over the model a bit.
Yes, I agree. In my conversation with Mr. Weaver this afternoon, he said he didn't feel it went far enough, and that there needs to be a way to ensure that it's equitable and fair, and he's working with the Coalition on that. So it'll be interesting to see what's landed on.
We've got the NDP in government, and Labour has a relationship with the NDP that goes back a long way and has varied over the years. Question about all that, Political Science Department at UVic, Jamie Lawson.
Around 2015, key union leadership across the country made an important move towards a rapprochement with the federal Liberal Party. And it's certainly clear that in the private sector, at least, a lot of union workers really favor the BC Liberals in terms of their resource job creation plans. Is it the case that union leadership is better off taking a more distant approach than they have in the past to partisan political leadership? Or is it the other way around?
Well, the relationship really varies, too, around the province.
It really does. You know, we did a lot of polling prior to this past election, and our role, we felt, was to identify what were the major issues for our membership, and then provide them information on where each political party stood. And affordability was the number one issue. Other concerns around healthcare, care for seniors and aging parents, childcare. And when we looked at each of the parties, clearly one was more focused on addressing those issues of affordability, of inequity, of poverty than another. And so is it my role to be more or less partisan? My role is to represent my membership. And if there is a party that aligns itself with the similar values that my membership holds, then that's certainly the party that I'm willing to work with and move forward on.
Now, the NDP has its convention here in Victoria, not this weekend, but next weekend. And one of the big changes in NDP conventions in the time I've been going to them is the Labour representation in the convention is quite different. You used to see lots of tables, and now union members join directly, right? You don't have the same delegated system.
There are some unions that are affiliated to the Fed and are affiliated to the NDP, and they get like 1 or 2 seats or something. It's quite small, and then they have to have members of the NDP and match that up in order to get more. So yes, you probably see a lot fewer union members who come just automatically. They come because they're active in their constituency, because they're members of the NDP, because they're delegates for one reason or another. I mean, the comment that I would make is that there's a broad range of engagement with the NDP in the labor movement. There are some unions that are directly affiliated. There are some that donate significant amounts of money but aren't affiliated. There are some that are nonpartisan. They don't give money to any political party. But there are very few, if any, one union who supported the Liberals. And I think that's because working people did not do well under the Liberal government here in BC. It's more complicated federally, I think, because you have 3 choices, and the federal Liberals are not as right-wing as our provincial Liberals were, I would argue. So I think that gets more complicated, but provincially, I think many unions did the analysis that Stephanie did with her membership and concluded that, we didn't do well under the BC Liberals and we would do better under an NDP government.
Yeah, I would guess federally there's a bit more hedging too, because the federal Liberals have often been in government, and nationally the NDP has never been in government. So you sort of need to
And there's also
bridge
the whole,
that as well.
I don't really want to go down this road because it's very contentious in the labor movement, but the whole strategic voting debate around the federal voting.
We will take a brief break on Voice of BC, and we will be back with the 2 union leaders and lots more to talk about. Stay with us.
In BC, there is a liquor server's minimum wage and a regular minimum wage. According to StatsCan, 80% of food and beverage servers making this lower minimum wage are women. It's about time that this government abolished the liquor server's minimum wage and ended what is essentially legislated gender pay inequity.
Whoa, I'm not driving. I'm way too stoned. How are you feeling, Beer?
Oh, since we had that talk, I'm not driving tonight at all.
What about you, Dave?
You only had a couple of drinks.
And only a couple of puffs.
I don't drink and drive. No way I'm getting behind the wheel when I smoked weed, too.
How are we getting home, then?
Oh, you can drive, Dave.
Come on, Dave.
Take one for the team, buddy.
Don't let weed and alcohol influence your decision to drive.
Yeah, I need a ride.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
It has become a topic of conversation that there is a shortage of workers in the workforce right now. Restaurants are having to shut down. This is a crisis for both business in British Columbia and for workers.
Welcome back to Voice of BC. We're going to go straight to a question. Another question from Maureen Karagianis, who you just saw there, but this time it's a question on tape. Here she is, Maureen.
The workforce nowadays is creating more part-time work in what's known as the gig economy. How does that affect labor, and what are you planning to do about those changes in the future?
That is exactly what our conference is about. I mean, there's many ways in which work is changing. The part-time, temporary nature of work, more term, more contract work, all of that is part of the ways in which work is changing. But I would argue that work has always changed. You know, if you looked at 100 years ago, there were completely different jobs than there are now. And so our challenge is to figure out, how do we make sure that work is good work, that people have decent wages and benefits, that they have rights at work, that they have representation? How do we organize unions in this new economy where people are more transient and not there as often? It's not like you go into a factory and organize and everybody's working in the same place and pretty much the same hours, though some of that work still exists. You know, I do think, though, that some of the global politics has driven down wages and benefits, and, you know, companies have gone to more part-time term, temporary work because it's cheaper. And I think there is an argument to be made that there's better economics with less transience and with a loyal workforce. So there's that difference around employment that we need to talk about too. But however people work, it has to be good work, and they have to have rights at work.
What's the demographic retirement situation like in the public service?
It is an aging demographic, not dissimilar to much of sort of organized labor. Although we have started recognizing or started to see a large number of younger workers coming into the public service. We've actually met with the Public Service Agency on sort of their human resources recruitment plan moving forward. And some of what Irene talked about earlier is, you know, people look at work differently. I know my kids do. And part of that is wanting to have a bit more mobility in terms of where they work. As I said, living in urban centers can be extremely challenging financially. So if we're able to make work possible more remotely, so these are all things that we have to look at. I would also say, to the former question, one of the roles that I see labor taking in addressing precarity in work is really looking at putting pressure on those who develop labor standards and employment standards to ensure that they keep up with changing work. So now we seem to have these runarounds and these loopholes that exist. So you're an Uber driver, oh, you're an independent contractor, no, you're not an employee, therefore you can't be organized, therefore you can't have a bargaining agent. And these are kinds of the workarounds that we see happening in the gig economy. We think that our role is to push to ensure that employment standards are created to protect all workers, regardless of the industry. Unpaid internships, that's another one. You know, hundreds and hundreds of hours of unpaid labor, and you're doing it for the experience.
Yeah. That's what they say. We've mentioned the minimum wage issue a couple of times, and it's being dealt with in one way in British Columbia anyway. We've got a question about the impact of the change in the timetable. Richard Truscott, here he is.
One of the impacts of a $15 minimum wage will be small businesses forced to increase prices. And that seems to go against the intent of raising the minimum wage, which is to put more dollars in people's pockets. Of course, small businesses will adjust by reducing hours, maybe cutting back on staff training and other budgets. So how is this, at the end of the day, really going to help the people that it's intended to assist? How is it going to help young people looking for their first job? What impact will it have on them?
Well, how about it?
Well, it just doesn't really happen. You know, we raised the minimum wage from $8 to $10.25 an hour in this province in a relatively short order because it hadn't been raised for 10 years, and employment numbers went up. More people were employed at $10.25 than at $8. It doesn't really cause inflation either, not on the large scale, because there are many macroeconomic factors that affect inflation, and raising the wage of a quarter of the population by a little bit doesn't have that huge an impact overall on inflation. It may mean that people have to raise their prices a few cents for sure, but the fact is that you sell your stuff or provide your service to a whole bunch of people and you employ a few people compared to that. So it doesn't mean, people will still have a lot more money in their pocket because they're going to go from $12 an hour to $15 an hour. And if the burger costs 3 cents more, they're still way ahead, right? So I don't think either of those effects really happen. In fact, we know they don't. We know that raising the minimum wage is good for the economy because what you've done is take the lowest segment of the population in terms of wages and put more money in their pockets. And they really only have one thing that they will do with that money, and that is spend it in their community. They don't have enough money to go on a foreign vacation or invest in a Swiss bank account. They really have better groceries for their kids, better clothing for their kids, enrolling their kids in a sports program they couldn't afford before, going to a restaurant where they couldn't afford it before. That's how low-wage workers spend their money, and that's all good for the economy. The other thing we have to calculate is the cost of poverty. Mm-hmm. The cost of poverty is enormous in our healthcare system, in our criminal justice system, in our education system. We all know that kids who grow up in poverty are more vulnerable in all of those areas. And we have to think about the cost of poverty.
So the government has this panel that's reviewing it. What's your understanding of when we hit $15 an hour? Have the Democrats backed off the target date for that?
I don't think so. I think what the panel allows us is to make the argument, which we will make, is that it should happen before 2021. Oh, okay. Because the 2021 date is not fixed now. And so we think we have very good arguments for before 2021, especially since Alberta will be there in October of 2018, 1 year from now.
So a year from now.
And Ontario in January of 2019.
Seattle there yet?
Seattle is mostly there. They had this complicated phased-in approach, but in the vast majority of cases, Seattle is there.
I just wanted to add one point, and I've heard Irene say this
many
numerous times, is this misconception that all of these under $15 an hour earners are young people. It is true. That is true. But in fact, a large number of low-wage earners are women in their middle age who, are working 2 or 3 part-time jobs to try and support families. So we're not talking about the 25-year-old in mom's house. Sorry, Connor. But we're talking about a number of workers who would benefit from having a family-supporting wage that would bring them above the poverty line.
I'm going to go to Jordan Bateman here, who, this maybe provide an opening for what many people will know is the host's favorite topic, Site C. So let's go to Bateman on this and see if it provides enough of an opening. Here's Jordan.
Over the past few weeks, we're seeing the NDP Green Alliance put thousands of jobs in jeopardy or outright cut them, whether it's killing the Massey Replacement Project, killing 2 Highway 1 expansion projects, reviewing Site C, or fighting Kinder Morgan. Those are real jobs being put at risk by the NDP. And yet we haven't heard a peep from the BC Federation of Labour on any of those important work issues. Do you still represent your blue-collar workers, and are you doing enough to stand up for their jobs?
Peep? Okay.
Well, You know, we have unions in the BCFED who support Site C, and we have unions that oppose Site C. And so we have to keep all those people together and represent them all. And they represent their members. And I would say we are doing lots of things to support people in blue-collar jobs, the apprenticeship and training issue that we talked about a lot, talking about project labor agreements with the government and how they're going to build major projects in this province. But governments have a right to decide what are good projects and what projects should be built and will be built to benefit the province. And that's what this government is doing. They're looking carefully at Site C to decide whether it's the right project, whether it's going to be beneficial in the long term. They may build it, and that will be great, and they may not build it. And they have the right to make that decision.
In the last round of public sector bargaining, they included a kind of a growth sharing
economic dividend. Yes,
economic dividend.
For the union, an economic dividend. It's been paid a couple of times.
It has.
What's the view in the GEU about that?
When we first heard about the economic stability dividend, I have to admit, I think there was a great deal of skepticism as to whether or not this would actually pay out for members, but it has.
Whether they cook the books.
Yes, it has.
Not that they ever do that in government.
No comment. But it's paid out about 0.5% a couple of times over the last few years. We're waiting to see whether or not it will pay out in the final years of the agreement.
I think you'll get it this year.
Yes, I
next
believe
year
so.
Because the economy really grew a lot faster than they expected.
I agree. Yes, I believe so. Again, 0.5% of an increase when we've talked about all of the housing costs and rising costs of gasoline and all of the other amenities that British Columbians rely upon, those increases certainly have not kept up. And so we see those being eaten up immediately in rising rental costs, housing costs, all of those other things, transportation costs. So,
okay. I got a question coming later about next round of bargaining, so I'll leave it till that. Let's go to, this is, somebody in the government told me that most of their legislation making time next year is actually going to be used on this because the federal government's insisting on going ahead by July the 1st, so you know what the topic is. President of the Press Gallery, Tom Fletcher, with a question about what's the best model for selling marijuana, if that's what we're going to do. Here's Tom.
Stephanie, Ontario has decided that they're going to build standalone marijuana retail stores. They're going to run the distribution through their liquor distribution branch, and they're going to staff those stores with the same union people who staff liquor stores in Ontario. British Columbia is pretty clearly not going in that direction. They're going to have different approaches in different towns. It seems fairly clear that the NDP government is going to incorporate at least some of the dispensaries that have popped up all over the place. What problems do you see with that, and can you convince this government that maybe that's not the way to go?
The GEU originally proposed doing it through the government liquor stores.
Actually, we're in an alliance with Now Able, which is the private liquor stores.
Right.
We call ourselves the Responsible Marijuana Retail Alliance, and shortly after the federal Liberal government was elected, we actually put a proposal forward knowing that eventually recreational marijuana was going to be legalized. And we still believe that the best model for British Columbia and British Columbians, both fiscally and in a socially responsible way, is to utilize our current distribution and liquor retail outlet system. We already distribute and retail a controlled substance. It's alcohol. This is another product. It's a recreational product for adults. We're not talking at all about marijuana that's used for medicinal purposes. We believe that that is completely separate. And if that's the role for dispensaries, I mean, clearly that's what they're doing now. So for us, we just feel that it would be extremely expensive for British Columbians to build a new infrastructure to deal with the retailing of recreational marijuana. We're an age-controlled environment. Our members have a clear historical record of double identification checking for the purchase of alcohol now. So we want to do something that is socially responsible and makes good financial sense for British Columbia.
Yeah, what I've heard the government say is that they don't, that their two biggest concerns are children and organized crime. I mean, it strikes me that one of the strongest arguments you've had is that your members already deal with the children issue. They've been dealing with it since we first had liquor stores.
That's exactly correct. It is an age-controlled environment. The other piece around that, too, is the zoning laws are already in existence about where a liquor store can be. So it can't be within a certain distance of a school or a park or a recreational center. So all of that infrastructure is already in existence. And, you know, the LDB has plans for the new warehouse out in Delta. It's a beautiful, large facility. It's, again, secure, because we are already dealing with a controlled substance. And I think people forget that that's what alcohol is.
So what happens in, I mean, the two places you hear about the problem is a few of the cities that have this staggering number of dispensaries that have just popped up overnight. What happens to those?
Well, I mean, that will be a decision for the provincial government. Regardless, I think, you know, the dispensaries should be licensed and regulated. I think that's the concern for most citizens. And in some communities where there is no dispensary, there is perhaps a liquor store. Other municipalities have the option to have a dry community. There are no liquor stores there. That may also flow through in terms of the municipal decisions around what is going to happen with recreational adult use marijuana. So what will happen with the dispensaries will ultimately be up to the provincial government.
Given any indication from the government when we expect to hear for what they're going to do?
No, I haven't. We continue to put forward our proposal and meet on this. We met with the Attorney General and had a conversation with him about it. He's well aware of our position, and we'll see how things roll out.
Round about February the 20th next year, a Tuesday, we will be getting the next provincial budget, and this will be the first full one under the New Democrats. We had an update in September, which had some changes in it, but this is the real deal, the full big budget. What are you expecting?
Well, I don't know. Nobody's telling me.
Like
but what I'd like to see,
what's your wish list?
There's two categories that I want to talk about there. One are sort of big issues that have an impact on working people but are not our sort of core labor issues, things like poverty reduction, child care. Those are two, I think, that we really want to see a significant plan around. I think that child care is a huge issue for working people, and we were very pleased to see the NDP support the $10 a day plan. There are some things that need to be funded that have been cut over the years, like the Employment Standards Branch. If you have a complaint about your employer and having difficulty, you have to fill out a self-help kit, a tool kit, where the first step is to confront your employer. Almost impossible for young workers, for new Canadians. So we need to beef up staffing in the Employment Standards Branch so people can have their issues dealt with. And the Labour Board as well, so people can get their certification votes done and all of that. So there is some staffing issues around these core services for workers, workers' compensation, employment standards, and the Labour Branch. So we would like to see some funding for those things, and we would like to see a significant investment in apprenticeship and training and improving those processes.
Your wish list.
Yeah, we did a submission to the Standing Finance Committee.
And
one of the big things, of course, around many of the things that Irene already spoke about, but also, you know, over the last 16 years, we've seen massive cuts in services in the public sector and in the broader public sector. And as a result, there are some pretty chaotic areas within government. I mean, there are those that make the headlines, like child protection services and frontline social workers, but there's much more behind the scenes. Admin support service staff have been cut so drastically over the last 16 years that, you know, we see backlogs. The fire season is a great example. I know it was in the House about invoices for contractors not being paid, but that's because we had admin support service staff going from Victoria to Williams Lake, living in tents, using outdated administrative equipment to try and deal with the influx of invoices. Park rangers, we've raised that issue numerous times. post-secondary education. I mean, there's 16 years, and we know there's 16 years of neglect that needs to be dealt with, and we certainly aren't expecting everything to happen overnight. But what we'd like to see is momentum. We want to see some bold steps in some areas that give a really strong message to British Columbians, to our members, and to community members around the province that there is a new government in town and that people are at the forefront of their policy and their finance decisions.
Interesting too, with a budget in British Columbia, you get 3 years of budgets, right? And the second and third years are always, they change, subject to change, but you'll still get an idea, 2018 in February, what the budget of British Columbia is going to look like almost up to the next election. So, because time flies. So this will be a pretty important document we get next February. The government's working very hard on it, and they've got a pretty big wish list of their own. So it will be a big day. On that note, we will take a brief break on Voice of BC. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Across the Western world, the union movement has struggled in recent decades with changes in technology, changes in business practices, changes in demographics, and changes in trade patterns. BC, like many places, has seen a drop in unionization from over 50% in the private sector at one time to in the mid-20% range now. As a result, our union leadership can no longer threaten a general strike and shut down the province as the IWA used to do. And unions just don't have as much influence or power as they got used to having in the 80s.
Are you worried about getting diabetes?
I'm a millennial.
Well, sorry, but 1 in 3 Canadians has diabetes or prediabetes.
Really?
The Canadian Diabetes Association, with support from Sun Life Financial, urges all Canadians to take the test.
For the labor movement, it's been 16 long years under the BC Liberals, where labor code, labor legislation, employment standards were all watered down, cut, or made unfair in their view and biased towards employers. With the BC NDP in power, they want to see changes, and they want to see them as soon as possible. That may not happen for a while through process, consultation, but they will be pushing all the way.
Welcome back to Voice of BC, and that last question I asked about the next budget was a shameless steal from Andrew McLeod of the Tyee. So fortunately, we have a second question from Andrew, and it's a very good one. So here's Andrew McLeod.
For many years, when the public sector unions bargained with the government, they were facing zero increases and sort of hardline negotiations. I'm wondering with the new government whether you expect something different there and how it's looking for the next round of negotiations.
So I believe most of the contracts in the BC public sector were 5-year agreements, and I believe most of them, so we're talking about contracts for more than 100,000 people, expire on the 31st of March 2019, which I guess means that this time next year, a lot of public sector unions will be into negotiations. What are you looking for next year?
Well, as I said, there's been 16 years of neglect, and it's been very, very challenging for members in all of our sectors, whether, again, it's in direct government or the broader public sector. So we'll be looking for, some adjustments. Bargaining is always bargaining. And we know that there will always be economic restraints depending on how things are going throughout the province. I think, though, that our members have been exceptionally patient and in many cases taking the zeros or the 1.5%, they've stood back and they've paid their dues. And many of them are ready now, I think, to see some increases that are well deserved for the work that they do.
Are longer-term agreements more popular now, with inflation being what it is and stuff like that?
Yeah, longer-term agreements are happening in a big way. I don't know about more popular. There's a big debate in our ranks about whether that's sort of giving in to have a longer term agreement. It certainly provides some stability, and I think that's important. And it's important in the public sector where we're talking about this. But there's quite a significant difference between 3 years and 5 years. So we'll see. We haven't, certainly, I don't think any of the unions have got to term yet to talk about what the term should be. But I think longer term agreements. The thing about bargaining is it engages your members, and you got to go to your members and talk to them, and they have votes about what's on the table, and they have possibly a strike vote, and so you get your members engaged. So if you can keep your members engaged in other ways, I think those longer term agreements are not too bad, but I think that is something that you have to pay attention to.
So doctors, teachers, all the different healthcare workers unions, main government employees union,
community social services, community health facilities, all of them.
Yeah.
So I would say
post-secondary,
post-secondary,
universities and
yes. So we are having those discussions around term, and I would say the general consensus from our senior leadership, they are not happy with 5-year agreements. That's what they hear from their members, because again, it's trying to forecast so far into the future that again the wage increases that are agreed upon clearly have not played themselves out in a way that have kept up with the cost of living. We're actually having our public sector bargaining conference this fall. And we are also doing our community social services conference. We want to really engage with our membership and find out what their priorities are. We want to be well prepared to go into bargaining, and we want to coordinate with other public sector unions that are in our bargaining associations in a way that, we want to lift up all of our members.
Now, of course, the politicians, the way they look at it is they sit there with a calendar and they go, when's the next election? And the last thing they want is a whole lot of bargaining going on in an election year. So they'll push you to either a very short agreement, or they'll want somehow or other an agreement that takes us to, I guess, March 31st, 2022? Well, it'll be a 3-year extension.
That's a 3-year agreement.
3 years.
That's not too bad.
That's not so bad.
Yeah.
That's not so bad.
Not so bad.
Okay, we've settled term.
2
years.
We've settled term, folks. It's British Columbia. Anything could happen. They may find
that is also true.
They might be bargaining with a different premier come around 20. Premier Weaver might be in the, anyway, we'll have a few jokes about that. So I'm going to have a stab at this woman's name, Caitlin Matulewicz. That's my guess. Sorry, Caitlin, if that's not the right way to pronounce your last name. Retail Action Network, and a very good question. Here she is.
Workers in BC's restaurant and retail industry, who are largely non-unionized, rely on inadequate employment standards legislation, and as a result, they face highly precarious working conditions. Right now, people in these industries have no right to paid sick days and often receive their schedules at the very last minute, sometimes even the day of. The BC government has recently announced the composition of the Fair Wages Commission, but even with the $15 minimum wage, these issues will remain unaddressed. How can unionized and non-unionized workers fight together for fairness at work that works for all?
What portion of the people who work in British Columbia are covered by a union contract, and what are employment standards?
About 30% are covered by a union collective agreement. It's very high in the public sector and lower in the private sector. But
so 70% of the people who work in British Columbia
are not covered by a
they've
collective
got employment
agreement.
Standards.
They've got employment
if
standards.
It says they get a vacation or a stat, they get it. And it has all the protections they're ever going to get.
Yes, and they have been eroded over the 16 years of the Liberal government. It used to be a minimum 4-hour call-out. Now it's a minimum 2-hour call-out. There used to be a requirement to get shift schedules, the issue raised there by Caitlin. So we want improvements in employment standards.
You also said earlier, but I think it's worth repeating, that the other thing is who do you complain to?
Who do you complain to?
And who goes and checks and makes sure it's happening?
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And there are improvements that need to happen that weren't there before, like paid sick days, like leave for victims of domestic violence. These are things that we'll be advocating for. So we have some ways to go on employment standards. It is the floor for workers, and I think government has a role to play in saying wherever you work and whatever form your work takes, there's a minimum set of standards we want employers to meet.
Your organization spends a certain amount of its time lobbying for people that aren't even members.
Absolutely, and I am very proud of the fact that that is well supported by our affiliates. We have that debate every once in a while. We had a big support for the $15 minimum wage campaign, which impacts largely non-union workers. So,
and I know a rising tide lifts all boats, I've heard it.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's go to Jordan Bateman. This is a big change coming to British Columbia. The bill is still before the House, but I think it'll pass and it'll take effect January the 1st of 2018. Here's Jordan with a question about it.
Over the years, the labor movement, your groups included, have given millions of dollars to the NDP and provided thousands and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of hours of in-kind donations and volunteer labor. Now that the electoral campaign financing rules are coming in, though, that's all going to change. So I want to know, what are you going to do with all that extra time and money?
Well, January the 1st is coming pretty quickly. Like, have you thought, what does it mean to, labor organizations? And I know business has given the Liberals a lot more money than Labor has given to the NDP.
Thank you for saying that.
There were some pretty big contributions in the spring, including a fairly large loan, as I recall, from the steelworkers. But what happens?
Well, we believe in limits on donations, and we believe in banning union and corporate donations. So we have supported that. We have policy on the books. We passed a motion at our last convention. So we support that. We support taking big money out of politics, partly because it's the right thing to do, and partly because we can never match the business donations. So it's not a level playing field. But I have an answer to Jordan's question, and that's what we want to do with the money. And there's not a one-to-one correspondence here, but one of the things we're working on is a Workers' Action Center for non-union workers. And we're kind of hoping that some of the money that unions donated to the NDP will go the way of that. We have other sources of funding, but the BCFED has a very small budget. And so while it looks like we donated a lot of money to the NDP, that was mostly releasing our staff before an election to work on campaigns once in a while. So that adds up when you have a well-paid unionized staff, as we do.
Does the legislation change mean you can't do that anymore?
Yes, absolutely.
So
federally, you can't release someone to work. That is a donation.
So somebody in their spare time at night.
Yeah, they can do it on their vacation. They can take their lieu days if they have lieu days in their collective agreement.
Okay, wow.
But they have to take vacation or lieu to do it federally. And that will be true provincially too. That is a donation.
Yeah. So as a union that did do direct donations, and again, all of those were decided by our senior elected leadership based on feedback from our members. We are in our budgeting cycle for 2018, and we have a political action budget line that we've always used, and those dues, because they belong to our members, will go back into resourcing our members. And we provide a lot of things outside of just the labor relations framework. Of course, all of the things that we do as core work of the union, bargaining, grievances, all of those sorts of things will continue, and we do that very well. But we've also expanded our education programs. We've really beefed up our occupational health and safety department and training with a focus on mental health. And so that's where those dues monies will augment what is already existing. But we're always going to have to politically engage with our membership, because politics affects every single thing we do. And in the case of direct government, it is their direct employer. And so politics will always play a very important role in what we do. And most of that will be around information and advocacy work, but not direct donations any longer or in kind.
This time next year, we will also be into the big referendum battle. The New Democrats are planning a referendum in the fall of 2018. I don't think they've given us the exact date yet, but it'll be a provincial date. It won't be the same time as the local government elections, and we'll be voting on whether or not we're going to give up the current electoral system and go to a system, one of several options perhaps, of proportional representation. So, fair question. Where do you stand? Here's Bruce Halser.
In the last two referendums on electoral reform in BC, some unions supported it and some actively opposed it. This time around, we've heard from BCGEU, for example, that they're in favor of proportional representation. I'm not sure we've heard from the BCFED or from other unions. Do you have a position on electoral reform? Do you have a preferred system? Will you be voting yes for any change in the referendum or only for some changes?
Well,
you're allowed to say you don't know the question yet, so you're not going to give the answer. But
well, no, we support electoral reform,
okay,
and we have that motion on the books. I wasn't sure we did. It goes back a little while, but the Canadian Labour Congress does as well. So both the BCFED and both the CLC support electoral reform. In neither case have we taken a position on the kind of electoral. We support proportional representation.
Right, in general. But
in general. So I will be voting yes, and I think the majority of unions will be too. I don't know that we polled all our affiliates, but this was a motion that passed at our convention, and so it is our position.
Yes, so we, as was stated in the question, we do support proportional representation as well. We also don't have a firm position on which model that should be. However, for us, it's clear that what has to happen is that every single vote needs to count in terms of, and it needs to be fair and it needs to be equitable. And so not knowing exactly what's on the ballot yet, as you said, makes it difficult to say, yes, I'll be voting for that particular model or not. But it's clear that a first-past-the-post system does not work.
We'll have probably in the spring, although the government's going to be busy in the spring, the results back from a public consultation on the options, and then we'll probably get some indication from the government what the question or questions will be on the ballot, what the option or options will be. And I would guess once that happens that we'll probably be into a pretty good debate about which system is best and all that other stuff that goes on. There'll be some public funding. There will be a yes campaign and a no campaign. Mr. Halser, who you just saw, will be a leader of the yes campaign, and the next guy will be a leader of the no campaign. And he's already getting fired up. The question he's going to ask isn't about that, but I know Tillman can hardly wait. Here's Bill.
Irene and Stephanie, the BC NDP government is doing many things that the labor movement has long advocated, but they're also doing a lot of consultation. There's consultation on the BC Labor Code, on the $15 minimum wage. There's no timeline on that one anymore, and some other things that are important to unions. Are you concerned that this government is doing too much consultation and not enough action?
Are you patient?
Well, I think we're patient, but not endlessly patient. And I think Stephanie said it before, and I think it's absolutely true. We have 16 years of things that happened that we didn't agree with and that undermined standards and the labor code and the WCB. And we know that's not going to change overnight. It's nice to be asked for a change, and we kind of enjoy the input we're having into lots of things. And to be clear, the Fair Wage Commission will make a recommendation on timeline by the end of the year. I mean, or at least that's their first report, and we hope that that will give us a timeline for the minimum wage. They may take longer. They certainly will take longer on some issues, and certainly on the living wage, minimum wage issue, they'll take longer. But that will happen pretty quickly. We are eager for changes to the labor code, but there are complexities too, and they need to consult on that. So we'll be patient for a year or so, and then we'll see. So ask us next time.
I'll have you back on this time next year. What do you think?
Well, I'm a pretty consultative person myself. It's the way in which I bring my leadership to my own union, and it is unfortunately a timely process. Like Irene, I think I share a cautious patience. What really, I think, when timelines arise and there's a report out, that's when we want to see, okay, have decisions been made? Where are we moving? What's happening? So we have the budget coming up. We have the timelines around the original reports of the different commissions. So I think consultation's not a bad thing. You want to try and build as much agreement on moving forward as possible, but you don't want to allow the process to become the be-all and end-all.
Yeah, I think the other thing that it's not an excuse, it's an explanation. It does take a long time to get stuff done in government. Legislation is complicated.
It is.
You need senior lawyers to draft it. You need to be sure you don't mix up some bill that you didn't mean to. takes a long time to get budgets through the House.
It's a big
Government's
ship.
complicated. And there's a big agenda imposed on government, like the Prime Minister deciding he's going to legalize marijuana next July the 1st. So the provincial government's got to change its law. So on that note, thank you very much, Stephanie Smith, for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you so very much.
Irene Lanzinger, thanks for having you on the show as well. And have
Always
a good
a
conference
pleasure.
this weekend.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. Good night.